This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 3 minutes after 10. A very good morning to you. Can I, will you indulge me just for one moment? A little bit of, what do we call them? Toto moments. Do we call them Toto moments? You know, when the little dog. Do you know that I think that dog's real name was Terry? No, I've probably got that wrong. But it popped up in a crossword I was doing the other day. When Toto pulls back the curtain of The Wizard of Oz and you see the somewhat harried and unimpressive old man behind the curtain pulling various bells and whistles in order to masquerade as a wizard, as an all-knowing, all-powerful Oz. I like to do that some mornings, as you know. So we used the word appeasement very early yesterday, and I did so very cautiously for two reasons. Number one, you have to be conscious of hyperbole. Donald Trump's presidency is going to throw up myriad horror shows, but it is also going to create scenarios which could be construed as an improvement on what went before. It's not quite the even a stopped clock is right twice a day scenario. It is just, for example, when dealing with bullies, sometimes an even bigger bully can be the best case scenario. But I am on the one hand conscious of avoiding hyperbole, and on the other hand conscious of not being a historian. I like to read a lot, but I haven't studied history since A-level. And even then it was, as I've told you on a few occasions, it was the Byzantine Empire that I focused on for my A-level, the rule of Charlemagne, the Carolingians, and of course before that the Merovingians, which is not necessarily of enormous relevance to 21st century continental Europe. But I used the word appeasement. I went in quite early on that word, and I felt that the quality of the calls was such that we were not only justified, but on occasion possibly guilty of being overly cautious. Some people preferred the word collaboration, to whom I'd respond by saying we have to wait and see. You know, we have to wait and see. There are people who say judge Trump on his actions, not his words, are naive, in my view, but equally the argument that you should wait to see whether he delivers on all of the apparently ludicrous promises or pledges that he makes are speaking rationally. So I mention all of that because when we came off air, the rest of the day essentially involved a vindication of sorts, a validation of sorts. And I'm just explaining this from a position of intellectual insecurity. I'm not showing off or boasting. I'm just saying, gosh, phew, I think we got that right. Sir Anthony Beevor, probably the doyen of 20th century military history, said yesterday, we should always distrust historical parallels, especially those from World War II. But there is a really very frightening echo of the betrayal of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and the idea that one can deal over the heads of a suffering nation. However, we took a call yesterday, I don't know if you remember, from a Slovak woman who introduced me to the phrase that they were talking about us without us. It's a really resonant phrase, and that is what Sir Anthony Beevor to you, Keith, that is what Sir Anthony Beevor is describing, that 1938 settlement in Munich, which saw Czechoslovakia essentially carved up or served up, Sudetenland served up to Adolf Hitler in negotiations that took place about us from the point of view of Czechs and Slovaks, but without us. So Sir Anthony Beevor has reached for the parallel with Munich in 1938, just as my callers did yesterday. And then you have Ben Wallace, former Conservative Defence Minister, speaking in similar terms in today's Daily Telegraph. You have even the Daily Mail, which of course doesn't mention the fact that its star columnist was putting Putin's cronies in the House of Lords not long ago, but today hands over a full page to a former deputy head of NATO to warn in unequivocal terms that is precisely the scenario that we could be looking at. Trump's handed Ukraine to Putin on a platter, writes General Sir Richard Shirriff. It's worse than Chamberlain's appeasement of Nazi Germany. So I'm mentioning all of this because some days you've got to park the partisanship at the door. That's what the national interest demands. the idea that because we've got a Labour government, we should do this, or because we quite like Donald Trump, we should avoid the parallels with Munich in 1930. This is an aligning of planets. This is a coming together of very disparate political positions or very disparate political perspectives, all now saying more or less the same thing, with the constant caveat, of course, that it hasn't actually happened yet. So although Vladimir Putin was no doubt dancing a little jig around the Kremlin yesterday, it hasn't actually happened yet. But the headline on Ben Wallace's piece, again, there's a whiff of Munich 1938 to the appeasement of Putin's Russia. So I wanted to get that all out of the way, and references, of course, to Neville Chamberlain as well. I wanted to get that all out of the way because when we come on air at 10 o'clock in the morning, I sometimes feel the ground beneath my feet to be quite thin, you know. And when you come on air with pretty hefty analysis, hefty claims, hefty analogies, hefty parallels, you are conscious of the possibility of ending up looking like a complete Herbert, looking stupid. But it was because of the quality of the calls yesterday that my confidence grew with every passing minute. That mention of appeasement, that mention of 1938, that mention of Sudetenland, that mention of Neville Chamberlain, all of these things were not hyperbole, were not premature, and crucially, of course, were not wrong. And that is why I do like every now and then to just say thank you. Thank you for helping me to produce radio programs, helping me and my team to produce radio programs that reach parts other radio programs cannot reach. And while I was thinking about why that was yesterday, I was struck by the thought that it was the callers from a non-British perspective that perhaps proved the most insightful. We heard from a former Vietnam veteran, now resident in Glasgow, about what he feels his country is abandoning, what he feels the United States is stepping back from, in a sense, as a role. It's a role that I have seen described this morning as the Pax Americana, that we talked again yesterday about the abandonment of the post-war settlement, the idea of leadership in Europe, America's role as a moral, a military, a financial leader in Europe appears at this point to be over, and that represents the cessation of Pax Americana. America's role as the guardian of security in continental Europe appears to be over. We had American callers pointing that out to us. We had a woman who has family in Estonia or Latvia, I think, a Baltic state, an American woman with family in Latvia, explaining the jeopardy that people there feel. And then we had the Slovak woman explaining why she feels and hears very ugly echoes of 1938 Germany. And then, because of my own intellectual insecurity, then today I see General Sir Richard Shirreff, I see Ben Wallace, the former Secretary of State for Defence, I see Sir Anthony Beevor, the doyen perhaps of Second World War historians, and various other representatives of the great and the good stepping up to make precisely the points that our callers made in yesterday's show. So, why the non-British perspective? Two reasons. The first is picked up on in a report on the front page of the Telegraph today. I've said it before and I've said it again. They do still publish good news journalism, even though their opinion pages have turned into the mother of all skip fires. And it's about why military chiefs are warning Keir Starmer that he needs to spend a lot more than is even currently planned on defence spending. Now, military chiefs always say that. You'll never meet a military chief who says, I'm a bit worried we're spending too much on military spending as a military chief. But one of the reasons they put forward, one of the Whitehall sources that's spoken to the Telegraph, for the problems they face in this field, is that the British public don't really buy it. Because we've never really been invaded, and we don't, well, not since 1066, and we don't really feel under threat. And therefore, the communication of any sense of urgent threat to the British people is incredibly difficult. even as we watch Vladimir Putin, the politician, of course, that Nigel Farage most admires in the world, even as we watch Vladimir Putin riding roughshod over any semblance of autonomy or sovereignty or international law, British people don't feel the sense of threat, which is, in this story, why they don't fully understand the importance of defence spending, given the choice between a bigger army or a better NHS or more roads or tax cuts or whatever your favourite thing may be. Then most of us are probably going to lean towards the stuff we can see and feel and spend over the bulwark against notional and theoretical military threats from overseas. And the other bit that I think makes Britain a bit of a outlier in these conversations is our history of insularity, our geographical insularity. It's not just the fact that we haven't been invaded for nearly 100 years. It's the fact that we were not occupied by Germany in the Second World War, and we didn't have, the English Channel notwithstanding, we didn't have a sense of being besieged. We had the Blitz, and we had epic sacrifice made by British soldiers, but we didn't have British people in the London equivalent of Vichy. You know, we were not occupied. We didn't roll over at the first sign of trouble, as many European governments did. I don't mean that to sound insulting, even though it probably is. But we were not under Nazi rule in this country. Not uniquely for Europe, but it's a crucial point when it comes to understanding the threat of a resurgent despot, but crucially the importance of America as a protector of Europe. A protector of Europe. What I want to do today, and it's by no means confined to people overseas. I mean, crikey, there's plenty of people living here whose roots are in continental Europe. But I wonder if you can provide the rest of us with a slightly more personal understanding of the role that America plays in European peace. The figure that really struck me yesterday was the amount of dollars that America had spent on supporting Ukraine. I grew up in the era of the Cold War. I grew up in the era of Russia being the massive enemy of all of the freedoms, all of the things that we took for granted. I'm still a little bit confused about why it still isn't perceived that way, why there are so many people in British politics, not just Nigel Farage and his mates, who seem to be very warm towards Vladimir Putin. Boris Johnson putting the son of a former KGB spy in the House of Lords and refusing to properly investigate possible interference in British votes. I always think of that Rocky film, where, the Russians are the absolute unparalleled enemies. But in Britain, we don't feel it. If you grew up in Berlin, you'd have had that sense, wouldn't you, of constant threat or constant tension because of the wall that was built through the middle of your city. So in order to understand the importance of the moment that we seem to be in, and again, things could de-escalate, things could go backwards, but when you have got General Sir Richard Shirreff, when you have got Ben Wallace, when you have got Sir Anthony Beevor, when you have got Patrick Cockburn, the brilliant war correspondent, when you've got all of the people you admire most in the fields of international diplomacy and military history, queuing up to compare current events to 1938 Munich settlement, Sir Chamberlain's appeasement of Nazi Germany. So you've got them queuing up to do that. You want to know what it means. And I don't know that we as Brits have as keen an understanding of what it means as our European cousins and neighbours might do. I could be wrong, so by no means feel excluded from this conversation if you've never set foot outside Sutton Coldfield. The question remains, what does this mean? What does America's mooted surrendering of its role as the guardian of Europe, what does that mean for Europe? Okay? 0345 6060 978. is the number that you need. What does that mean? If you grew up in a Baltic state, if you grew up in Poland, if you grew up in Germany, Italy, France, the Netherlands, all of these countries who have a much more personal relationship with the role that the United States has played in safeguarding security in post-war Europe on this side of what was once called the Iron Curtain, then can you help the rest of us understand, if you're in Hungary, if you're in Ukraine, wherever you are, or if you have connections to those countries, to those parts of the world, I don't think we feel it in our bones in Britain in the same way that we would if we'd grown up feeling that America was like the dam against originally Nazi Germany, of course, but subsequently Russia against a resurgent USSR. So help us out, will you, please? 0345 6060 973. What does America's current decision, the American president's decision to surrender the United States' historical role as the protector of European freedom and security, what does that mean to you? And crucially, of course, to Europe. 0345 6060 973. A big ask this morning, but I know you won't let me down.
James O'Brien on LBC.
31 minutes after 10 is the time. So at risk of maligning my fellow citizens, I'm not sure the British have as full a grasp of the importance of America, the United States of America, to European security since 1949, and therefore the potential importance of America, the United States under Donald Trump electing to abandon that role. The one I liked here from Anton, before I go to Andre. Anton writes, "Hi James, in Sweden we call what you are describing peace traumatization. We haven't been invaded, besieged, occupied or in conflict for over 2 centuries now, so it's very hard for us to understand what it would be like in any of these situations." I haven't heard that phrase before. I think it's helpful. Andre is in Golders Green. Andre, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call. So I'm from Romania, and I was telling your producer that Romania has never experienced democracy since basically the Iron Curtain fell in 89. Without America being there as a protector, we had 7 years. In 97, we joined NATO. And since then, we have been protected by a complete takeover by the Russians. And we have, apart from maybe before 1930s,
yes,
we have never had anything like this before. Everyone's literally panicking in Romania. I don't know if you know, they canceled elections in December.
Right. Because
a huge interference from Russia was discovered for a candidate. And now we are in a process of having the second time the elections, the presidential elections. So for us, it's very, very, very worrying because.
And it's a modern worry. It's a current worry. This is what I think Anton means by peace traumatization, is that I can talk to you about the Second World War. I can talk to you about the counterfactuals. You know, the great novels have been written about what would have happened if Hitler had invaded this country. But crucially for Eastern Europe, it's what happened after Hitler had been vanquished and Stalin got into the driving seat. And when we talk about the tanks crossing borders and moving into countries, we see history books, you see potential repetition. You see what happened in Ukraine and you think of your own history.
So I would compare it with, you know how I always hear that the Jewish suffering has been transmitted through generations?
Yes, transgenerational trauma.
Exactly. So exactly the same happened with the communism. I'm 38 and my mom is being haunted by that period, and her grandparents and my grandparents were haunted by that period even until today. So my mom is deeply affected by the way she grew up in communism.
Of course.
And I'll give you a very small example. The way you ration food, never throw food away that is not completely finished, and stuff like that. It's very small. They all come from the communist period. And for me, it's baffling sometimes. I live in UK, and but it's baffling how much they are affected by it.
And I'm looking at pictures of the Russian tanks rolling into Romania in 1947, forcibly annexing or drawing Romania into the Warsaw Pact. And the role that America plays for your generation, does your generation see America as being the major line of defense against that sort of aggression, that sort of ambition, imperial ambition?
Yes, my generation, yes. But I must say the previous generation, my parents' generation, had a dual vision on this one, because there was that Yalta Treaty where, if you remember, they carved up in a bit, Europe.
Yes.
And we felt a bit betrayed at that point by what happened between Churchill and I think it was Eisenhower.
Stalin, about us, but without us, I suppose, would be the phrase that I learned yesterday.
Exactly like one of your callers said yesterday. I listened to you, yes.
And that was in 1945. So I suppose the defence from the West would be that Stalin had played a crucial role in the defeat of the Nazis and therefore came away with expectations that the West had little choice but to meet. But that's a conversation for a different day. So finally, how do you feel personally about the not yet guaranteed but very likely prospect of the United States essentially saying to Europe, you're on your own now?
We basically feel a little bit out in the wilderness in terms of security, because there's no one else to protect us. Romania is such a small country in terms of resources. We have a shield now, so we have a NATO shield in Romania that protects us, let's say, from maybe a few rockets, but nothing on the scale that what happened in Ukraine, if it would have happened in Romania, without NATO, we would have folded in less than
which
a
is
month.
Of course what Putin thought would happen in Ukraine, and is I give or take what happened in Crimea. Andre, thank you. And that election that he refers to again, I think is I don't know what sort of coverage it received across the rest of Europe, but most people here will be vaguely aware that a parliamentary election, a presidential election, was essentially annulled because of the evidence pointing to epic Russian interference, Russian misinformation, which is why I opened yesterday's show by reminding you that in Estonia, they consider teaching media literacy to be a matter of national survival. Such is the effort put into persuading people of things that are not true. And that is how you end up having politicians in Eastern Europe or Western Europe elected to parliaments, even to presidencies, who are sympathetic to the Kremlin, which is why you should keep a very close eye on any politicians in this country who tell you that Vladimir Putin is the politician they admire most, or any former politicians who put KGB spies' sons in the House of Lords. And that is still unfolding, as Andre reminds us, in Romania. So what guards against that sort of influence and interference, if not the West? And until very recently, the West was almost a synonym for the United States, or certainly for the alliance of powers, among which the United States was by far the most powerful. Helen's in Bromley. Helen, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello.
Hiya. I feel really passionately about this. My mother's Polish. I'm half Polish. I'm bilingual. And I still have a family member living in Poland. When Ukraine was invaded, we as a family didn't think it strange that we came up with an exit plan that should the balloon go up, we can get my aunt out of Poland quickly. And to me, it doesn't feel strange. To my friends, it was completely alien.
They thought you were bonkers.
Yeah, completely.
That's precisely the point I'm trying to make today, actually. But I don't think I've made it as starkly as you do, because that is a real and present concern for you. And yet for us, sitting in relative complacency, even though we're informed on current affairs, that sounds ridiculous overreaction.
No, I mean, when Litvinenko was poisoned, my mother and I were saying to each other, why is everyone so surprised in England? Because that's what the Cheka, which is pre-NKVD, that's their modus operandi. That's exactly what they did. They, the fact that they came to this country and, put British citizens at risk by putting Novichok, as they did, and killed poor Dawn, I can't remember her surname.
Sturgis.
That's exactly that. Doesn't that go to show people that they really just don't care at this point? So what they do in Europe how much more clear could Putin be with regards to what he thinks of Ukraine? You know, this Nazification. You know, as someone, I think it was Anton, your previous caller from Romania, what he was saying about his mother being traumatized by the communist regime. My mother, the same. You know, it's not about food, but for example, she hoards quite a bit.
Really?
And that is purely down to the fact of the shortages. When I used to go to Poland in the 90s as a child, I very clearly remember going to the shops and queuing, and then the ensuing melee that would be in order for you to secure something. I remember the fact that you had to walk around with, my granddad had dollars in his car, because if the police, or militia as it was called then, not politia, which is a very, you know, militia as opposed to police, he had to have dollars because he would be stopped. There would be no question. He would slip him the dollars, off you go. That was normal.
And you know, just the primacy of the dollar itself is part of the conversation that we're having. But what role does your mum in particular, or even you, or rather, how do you respond to the idea that the United States seems set to abandon the position that it's held in this context since 1949?
Completely horrified, because Trump is essentially going back to the isolationist America that was pre-Roosevelt. So what people may not know, and some do, is that when Charles Lindbergh was in the campaign to become president or senator, I can't remember which, his campaign was based on America First.
Yes.
That isn't new. That is repeated. His actual claim was America First.
Another comment piece today, I haven't got it in front of me, but another comment piece say we're about to find out exactly what America First meant all along.
Yes, and you know, I feel like we're living in a dystopian world. I can't watch dystopian type TV programs because to me they're too much close to the truth.
Well, that's what Margaret Atwood said about the Handmaid's Tale, actually. She said it's a warning.
I saw a T-shirt the other day saying "Make Orwell fiction again."
Yeah, well, I mean, he'd be filed under the same. America First was originally, before Lindbergh, it was Woodrow Wilson's mantra for keeping the United States out of the First World War on the grounds that it has nothing to do with us. And you're right, it seems to be a very resurgent philosophy, and it's one, I think we were right, going by the early responses to the question, that in Britain we do have that thing that Anton told us was called peace traumatization, that idea that we don't understand the immediacy of a threat, even after watching Russian tanks pour into Ukraine, pour into Crimea, expecting on both occasions to be unchallenged correctly on the second one in Crimea, but incorrectly, as it turned out, on Kyiv. So what does it mean, this surrendering of American power? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Suppose, in a way, I'm asking today what it is that we Brits, those of us born and bred in this country with little or no direct connection to continental Europe, certainly to Eastern Europe, what do we miss? What do we not grasp as keenly as we would had we grown up in a Europe that had fallen to the Nazis and then been carved up by the United States, the United Kingdom and Russia into the post-war settlement? What do we not fully appreciate with regard to the role of the United States in the post-war settlement? Emma Duncan writes a brilliant piece in The Times today talking about how historically the victors emerge from war to wreak vengeance upon opponents and seize territory. She writes, Europe was a pile of rubble in 1945, so America might have enslaved Germany and turned the rest of the continent into a vassal state. Instead, it paid for the reconstruction of enemies as well as friends through the Marshall Plan. And the apparent decision by Donald Trump to just step back from that, again, as Emma Duncan writes, he's ripped up the rules. He's cast doubt on NATO's future. He wants America to be the kind of superpower that thinks threatening to invade allies like Canada, Greenland and Panama is fine. No interest in soft power. His Secretary of State for Defense yesterday said something about values are all very well, but you can't shoot values. And, you know, we understand now that there's a constituency of people who think that that's a helpful contribution to international discourse or to international diplomacy, never mind public discourse. You can't shoot values. What? So in Britain, I think we're a little bit, what's the word I want? Is it insulated? A little bit insulated? Privileged? I don't know. I don't know. So if you're not, help us out. Tell us what it is that you fear most about the withdrawal of the United States from the role it has upheld since 1949. Since 1945, really. 10:38 is the time. Edin is in Newton in Paris. Edin, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. I spoke to you a couple of times. I'm a former UN interpreter from Bosnia.
I remember, yes.
Yeah. I'm just listening to your callers as well. There is loads of concerns with the bordering countries that border Russia, like Baltic states, Poland, and all that. But it's important to know that this American withdrawal from Europe, it's affecting the Balkans now again. It's starting to flare up in Bosnia. The Serbs are again calling now. They waited for the Trump to get in, start calling again for partition of Bosnia. And it's important to know that Americans intervened in 1995 to stop the Balkans, to stop a war in Bosnia. And recent Trump's information is that stopping U.S. aid, it's affected over 100 NGOs operating in the Balkans.
Already?
Already. It's because the funding is being stopped. And there are calls that, well, it is evident. I mean, I listen to Bosnian news every single day and watch Bosnian TV, that the Serbs in Bosnia are being almost propped up by Russia now, and lack of American involvement already start calling partition of Kosovo, Bosnia, and there are serious fears that I hope I will not call you in 2 or 3 years' time to say, remember when we spoke, the Bosnian war is kicked off again.
So
because the EU, it's concentrating on Ukraine. Serbs will use this opportunity now. America turned away, EU too busy trying to sort the Ukraine problem. Let's have de facto restart the Bosnian war.
We're talking about territorial ambitions, a greater Serbia.
Exactly. What they haven't achieved in 1995, that they were stopped by America, they will now try again. There are already political difficulties in Bosnia. The Serbs are stalling progression of Bosnia into EU and into NATO. It's all fueled by Russia. So it's not just bordering states, it's internal states that Russia will use to destabilize Europe further.
And the role that the United States plays in terms of soft power in resisting that is best illustrated by what you've just said about the NGOs and Elon Musk boasting about putting USAID through the shredder. I think he said he'd put it through put it through the shredder, and you know, they're telling lies about condoms in Gaza or something like that, but not mentioning the fact that these organizations that exist to uphold
civic society
is the phrase I wanted. Exactly that are often funded by the richest country in the world.
Yeah, to prop up this Bosnian youth, Serbian youth, Kosovo youth, to be more pro-European, which they are. I mean, there are major protests in Serbia happening now against the current Serbian government, which is very sitting on two chairs. Vučić is sitting on a European chair and on a Russia chair. Now he's accepted the invitation for May Day celebrations to go and meet Putin with Lukashenko and all that. It's really worrying that Vučić is playing dangerous cards, but he looks like that he's leaning towards Russia now. And
I guess when you listen to me on the radio, or at least when you listen to most UK media, the sense you get is, I use the word we very loosely, are not really involved in this. We're not really affected by this, and yet for everybody else, it's a real and present threat. I mean, it's a moment of jeopardy, genuine jeopardy. Yeah. Is there a silver lining of sorts? I've seen a brilliant thread on Blue Sky by Sam Friedman, who's a commentator I admire enormously, and he talks about the possibility of a realignment that would see Europe emerge stronger and more committed to the sort of causes that you describe.
Possibly. It's Brexit. Don't start me on that.
Don't you hate people who can't let Brexit go, Edin? Honestly, there's nobody worse.
This was the scenario that Russia played through Brexit to destabilize UK, to destabilize Europe. That we got, Farage and them supporting it. They just don't realize what have they done to the UK. They torn us from that a bubble of protection of our friends who are like literally 22 miles across the pond, that this couldn't be played better for Russia now. Destabilize this. Trump is like this way saying, you're on your own, guys, and Russia now said, thanks very much, we'll crack on.
Yes, and I mean, that is an unknown, really, isn't it? What moves into any vacuum that is created by American withdrawal is very much up for grabs. And as I say, when you're in this country, you don't feel that you've got skin in the game, which is a terrible phrase, but apt, I think, in this context. Whereas for people whose lives have been framed in the crucible of conflict, in the crucible of war, genocide, and the rest, then it feels completely different, which is perhaps why some of the British coverage has taken me by surprise today. It's as if this morning everybody has suddenly woken up and started going, "Oh my days, this is 1948. This is 1938. I beg your pardon. Oh my days, this is Chamberlain. Oh my days, this is a massive threat to the world order, to European peace." 10:45 is the time. Elaine says, "Can you talk about this for more than an hour? It's really important." To which I can only respond by saying I can only deal with the callers that I get. So if you think you've got something valuable to contribute to this conversation about perhaps what we miss in Britain. I should mention Alan, very angry that I keep saying British because he insists he's Scottish, which I completely respect, but I'm not sure at this point in the conversation it's necessarily the most important element to be drawing my attention to. But if you are British or Scottish or Welsh, if you live in the United Kingdom and always have lived in the United Kingdom and don't have any particular familial or historical connections with continental Europe and the Baltic states or Eastern Europe, then what are we missing that perhaps we wouldn't miss if we had the familial connections of all our callers so far with regard to the significance of the moment that we find ourselves in? A moment where you've got former Tory defence ministers talking about a whiff of Munich 1938, a moment where you've got Sir Anthony Beevor, the doyen of military historians, speaking in similar terms, a moment when you've got the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe of NATO, General Sir Richard Shiref, speaking, writing in the Daily Mail, which of course has a star columnist called Boris Johnson, who was putting Vladimir Putin's pals in the House of Lords not long ago, writing about this current situation being worse than Chamberlain's appeasement of Nazi Germany. He writes, of course, of the appeasement of Evgeny Lebedev's father's former boss, Vladimir Putin. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49, you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's always sort of amazed me, really, how little we know about that thing that Edin just described about the position currently being taken by the Serbian leader, that knife edge, that wobble. Much of the British establishment wasn't just sort of ambivalent about Hitler. They were profoundly warm towards him. They really liked what they saw, up to and including members of our own royal family. As you know all this. But the media as well, the Daily Mail was all over him. Owner of the Daily Mail in personal correspondence, not just with the Führer, but with some of his key lieutenants as well. And senior members of the aristocracy, not interested not just in appeasement, but in active collaboration with the Nazis. There's a brilliant piece I told you about, didn't I? I posted it on Blue Sky. I only use Blue Sky now, by the way. If you're wondering why I haven't read any of your tweets out for a couple of months, it's because I'm never there. Blue Sky is the platform I favour and heartily recommend. It's not perfect, but it's a lot closer to pleasantness than anything Elon Musk is in charge of at the moment. There was an extraordinary piece in Harper's Magazine in the United States. I forget exactly which year. I think it was in the late 30s, early 40s. And it just involved the journalist, who was also a foreign correspondent, going around a social scenario in the United States and working out who'd be a Nazi. explaining who'd be a Nazi. I sometimes play the same game with the UK media. I really do. I sometimes look at columns or listen to broadcasters, many of whom, of course, like to twirl them, preen their tail feathers and pretend that they're enormously patriotic. Look at politicians. Some have come out and said that Vladimir Putin, for example, is the politician they admire most in the world, like Nigel Farage, or said that Russia has every right to march into country. If you poke the Russian bear, they say, you can't not expect it to respond, which is a bit like saying, well, reparations were so hard on Germany after the First World War. Of course they were going to invade Poland. And he's in Parliament now, Farage. So you look around and you think to yourself, who would, if Putin did go on the march, who in our establishment, political and media figures, who would be still cheering him on, still describing him as the politician they admire most in the world? And I do it in my profession as well. I look at it, kind of people who talk about Trump derangement syndrome, or the kind of people who talked on January the 6th about how Donald Trump had surrendered any right ever to rule again, or even to be taken seriously as a responsible political figure, who've now undertaken full reverse ferrets, gone entirely in the opposite direction. That ability, that, should we call it a moral pliability, that level of moral pliability is a lot more common than perhaps we realise when we're growing up in relative peace and stability, because we're not offered the choice. We can all say when it's easy, when there's nothing at stake, when it involves no sacrifice, that we're on the side of freedom and integrity and values. But when push comes to shove, as the Republican Party in the United States has shown, self-interest is going to overcome your interest in freedom, integrity and values almost every time. And so you never know. You never know who would go, who would turn, who would pull on the armband, given the chance, or wave through the abuses, given the opportunity. 10:52 is the time. Darius is in Kensington. Back to the role of America and the significance of its diminishment. Darius, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hi, Brian. Sorry. I'm from Lithuania originally. I live in London now, but I old enough to remember old days while we were still the part of Soviet Union, yes. And Lithuania was occupied by Russians after the Second World War. And back then, my grandmother was really a young kid. She used to take me to the kind of furthest room on her farm, close the door, and tell me the stories, how everything happened. And back then, she told me, I remember it clearly, that, Americans through, American Voice Radio were always telling us that we're going to come and we're going to liberate you. You just need to hold up and, and wait. And because of that, thousands of young men and boys went to the woods in Lithuania to fight Russians.
I didn't know that. And that's soft. That's soft power, isn't it? Again, that's what gets filed under foreign aid now by tabloid journalists. But running media organisations and NGOs like the ones you and Edin have described is part of the foreign aid expenditure to keep what we would call values alive. To keep values alive.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Those guys were promised that someday, very, very near future, the Americans will come and the country will be liberated. We will be helped in the fight against Russian communist government back then. And it never happened. Thousands and thousands of boys and young men died in the woods. And the last ones were in 1956.
And the Iron Curtain came down with you on the wrong side of it.
Yeah. And
but
then,
now,
when I was kind of young lad back then, 30 years ago, when we were first in Soviet Union to break away from Soviet Union, and we said we're going to be independent, and we kind of stood firm, on that. Even then, some Americans came to us and said, no, don't rock the boat. You just need to go slowly because you can.
So you've got a much more complicated relationship with the United States than some of the other people that we've spoken to. And yet, Lithuania today in the European Union, in the Council of Europe, in NATO, in Schengen, in the Eurozone, all of which, I mean, with the exception of NATO and in the OECD as well, what does an American withdrawal from Europe and the message that sends to the Kremlin say to you? What does that...
It's repeating of history. Now, one day they say, "Oh, we're going to help you," and next day, Sarge's office world comes and say, "No, we're going to look after our own."
That's really, really interesting. It's a much broader. You take a much broader historical sweep and say America let us down last time, and now they're going to let us down again. Whereas I see the modern United States as being distinct, deeply distinct from the United States of FDR, which again is the complacency of my history, my geography.
It's always these like up and downs, and we can thank America for many good things they did, but it was always on the edge, and
and that is something you'd have to grow up in Lithuania and elsewhere to feel. As I've said from 10 o'clock this morning, something I can't feel because I don't have that personal investment or that sense of constant jeopardy. We normally only really talk about it, as an earlier caller alluded to, with reference to the Holocaust, talk about transgenerational trauma, intergenerational trauma. But of course, growing up in privation, in poverty, in constant threat, in fear, growing up with the Cheka or the Stasi potentially badgering your every step, that passes on enormous generational trauma as well. But a sense of betrayal by the Allies at Yalta, a sense of betrayal by the Allies among much of Eastern Europe, being handed over to Stalin, is also relevant to modern opinions. Nobody, though, having a crack at explaining why we shouldn't be worried about what is happening at the moment, except for Darius's fatalistic reminder that the great tides of history don't just ebb, they also flow. Clara's in Teesdale. Clara, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
I remember phoning you 3 years ago when Putin invaded Ukraine. And
I remember it very well, Clara.
Oh, you do?
Of course I do. You're Hungarian. You're a Hungarian refugee, I think.
I am, yes, that's right. And as I was telling your researcher, I'm quite emotional a bit about it at the moment, with everything that's happening. Because obviously I've lived in the UK for 68 years now, and but I've been back to Hungary and a number of times. Still have family there, and my father actually left me his autobiography that he wrote.
Gosh.
Just before he died, and I've been researching my family tree. So obviously I've been going through it and what have you, and it's suddenly sort of I realised that. The main reason that my life evolved the way that it did, and why I had to leave my homeland and family and language and culture, was because of this, political ideology and the way sort of, communists and dictators and after the war and everything happened, because obviously Hungary became behind the Iron Curtain. And when the Hungarian, I won't give too big a history, but when the Hungarian Revolution sort of exploded, the Prime Minister Imre at the time was actually putting out over the radio messages asking for help from America, because behind the scenes, America and the CIA had been encouraging the freedom fighters. Because obviously America, they were anti-communist, as you know, McCarthy and everything was a big anti-communist. But then when the Hungarians, wanted to uprise against the communist regime and what they were doing to the Hungary and their ideology, I think they honestly thought that America would be there and help. And obviously, for their own political or whatever reasons, they didn't. And
this is missing. This was missing before you and Darius rang in from our conversation today. That period between the end of the Second World War and the fall of the Iron Curtain, when the United States was no use whatsoever to people in either of your home countries.
No.
But in the period since the peace, if you like, that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, America, the United States, has been the biggest guardian of that peace, and now they're off. So how are you feeling about that today?
Well, that's really what sort of scares me and worries me for the Eastern European and for Europe. Because obviously Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary now, as you know, for a number of years, he's got this real sort of right-wing nationalistic ideology, which, let's face it, Trump and the Republicans over there have really embraced, and
seem to have done, and that is, I mean, the first time that's ever happened. There's a difference between not being there to support the freedom fighters or the resistance in Lithuania and Hungary, and turning into a United States version of the actual nationalist oppression, which is what some people feel might be happening in the White House. Clara, I have to go because I'm late for the news, but it's lovely to hear your voice again. Thank you so much for ringing in, and I hope you and your family are very well, and that this moment passes, although I appreciate how naive that sounds, even as the words come out of my mouth. It is 11:02. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 6 minutes after 11 is the time. We may have to do a missed information this hour on the Rachel Reeves story. I just noting the number of people who think that she's being accused of fiddling her parliamentary expenses in the way that many MPs were found to have done not long ago. I've got one message here saying, how much grief did Zahawi get for heating his stables or the ones with the duck house? So it's a really odd story, this Rachel Reeves business, that I can't quite get my head around. You're always conscious of not wanting to be too partisan, and I don't think anybody sensible would argue that the current lot are anywhere near as bad as the last lot. You'll remember we've had ministers resigning from the Labour government who haven't broken the ministerial code. Well, the last several Tory governments had ministers galore who clung on to power despite having broken the ministerial code. Boris Johnson, of course, on one occasion telling everybody to form a square around the Pritzker when she was accused of, or when she was found to have bullied civil servants. So Rachel Reeves is not accused of any things like that. But when you see the BBC getting involved in a story, you do find yourself thinking maybe there is a little bit more to it than I originally thought. And yet the more I read into it, the more I think there isn't. Someone she used to work with says that they were quite cavalier in their expenses claims at a bank nearly 20 years ago. Oh, right. And her LinkedIn has exaggerated the amount. Well, when she says I worked somewhere for the best part of a decade, it turns out it might only have been 5.5 or 6 years, which is, of course, the best part of a decade. But technically, it sounds a little bit rum. It's a little bit cheeky. But no one applies. I mean, she's not Chancellor of the Exchequer because of what it said on her LinkedIn biography. It's not her CV. It's not what you send to an employer trying to get a job. Even if it was, Ian Duncan Smith's CV was an absolute farrago of nonsense, and it didn't stop him becoming leader of the Conservative Party. So I'm not quite sure, but I do just want to make it clear for the benefit of people who've clearly been led, either deliberately or accidentally, into the space that this is somehow a parliamentary expenses scandal. Unless I'm missing something, someone's not told me the details here. There's absolutely no suggestion whatsoever that this is a story about her expenses while she was an MP. It's entirely about her expenses when she worked at a bank nearly 20 years ago. And she hasn't lied on her CV either. She's got a LinkedIn profile. I don't even know what my LinkedIn profile says. But anyway, I'm just putting it out there because I could be wrong. But we may need to do a missed information a little later. Have we checked every MP's LinkedIn account for 6 months disparities between what happened and what actually didn't happen? And do they do them themselves? I don't know. But anyway, at least she hasn't put the son of a KGB spy in the House of Lords, eh? So we turn our attention next to Generation Z, and I insist on calling it Z. If you think it's called Z, that's fine, but tomato. I am calling it Generation Z. And the Times has done some fascinating but not necessarily very shocking research into how they feel. It's a cohort of people generally regarded to have been born between 1997 and 2012. So give or take. That is Tony Blair to the Olympics in old money. There you go. Born between the arrival of Tony Blair in Downing Street and the arrival of the Olympic torch in London. Oh, that was quite poetic, wasn't it? We talked about some of these issues a lot on this programme. The phrase that pops up most is social contract. Well, at least it does on this programme. I appreciate it's not necessarily true everywhere. But the phrase that has popped up most when we talk about the plight, and I use that word advisedly, the plight of younger people is social contract. I never really... There's so many things I didn't understand before I had this job. I'm not going to wang on about privilege. I'm a lucky person in the context of the family that I have and the opportunities I was given. And therefore, perhaps I didn't fully appreciate what social capital was, as opposed to capital. You know, I always dreamt of being I didn't dream, I always intended and expected to be a homeowner. And most people of my generation who grew up intending and expecting to be homeowners became homeowners. But lots of people grew up forever not expecting it. And their social contract was therefore different from mine. And their social contract involved more social capital than mine. The NHS is social capital. So, you know, the state of the NHS is a diminishment in social capital. What you get back from society in return for what you put in is probably the best way of describing the social contract. So if you look around and feel a sense of bleakness, then your enthusiasm for putting in is going to diminish. I think, and the Times haven't picked up on this in today's research, but I expect they have already when I wasn't paying that much attention to the news earlier this week, or they will do soon. I think this is part of the conversation about economic inactivity. That's when the phrase social contract has popped up most often. So you've got the usual idiots claiming that it's all because we're teaching too much in schools about the empire or slavery, or why is this generation so demoralised? Why is unhappiness so commonplace in this generation? And here's an idiot from the Daily Telegraph to claim that it's because we're teaching children the truth about the empire these days, and we never used to when we were all much happier then. Rule Britannia, Britannia waves the rules. But what it is more likely about is a sense of purpose and a sense of worthwhileness. Why do you do what you do? It always feels a bit like a Kinks song, this, but we're not all Ray Davis. That idea of not wanting to be part of the 9 to 5, thinking that you'd be able to sort of break out of the rigmarole. But the rigmarole was stability and security. You got looked after in return for doing something that may have involved varying degrees of dullness, but it was worth it because of what you got back. The scale, the Times reports today, of the financial and mental health challenges facing young Britons is laid bare today. It shows a cohort, a generation, heavily indebted and increasingly seeking professional help with life's stresses. It's a generation worse off and less happy than they thought their parents were at the same age. So some of the statistics are stark. A third of young people have sought medical help for depression or other mental health issues in the past 3 years. And I'm afraid to, if you don't know already, that just because they've sought it doesn't mean they've received it. And just because they've received some doesn't mean that it has been adequate. We know that the simple matter of access to health services, particularly mental health services, is currently a national scandal. We know that they dealt with COVID, and the full consequences, the full impacts of COVID are not going to be understood for years to come, but 2 years during which they were largely compelled to stay at home instead of going to school or to university or starting work. So that would have taken a big bite out of some of these young people. 36% of this generation have said, 36% of women in this generation have said it still affects their mental health, 30% for men. And then you look at the financial situation, that the idea that you are 51% of this generation think that they're generally worse off than their own parents were at the same age. Only 24% think they're better off. It's a 51%, more than double the number of young people think they're worse off than their own parents were at the same age. And that fascinates me. And it fascinates me because I think it's one of the single most important elements of our society at the moment. And the fair play to the Times, they've done a fairly good job on this, but it's so often couched in the language of late middle age, a category into which I think I probably almost fit now, but I'm early 50s. I'm thinking of men in their early 60s who still talk about things like mental health or things like economic inactivity, as if we're still living in the 1980s, as if you can get a house with a 100% mortgage, or all of these things. You're right, there is no A in the middle of rigmarole. I don't know why I always say rigmarole. I've invented an entire syllable there. Thank you for pointing it out. You didn't have to do it in quite such great numbers, but it's a nice sounding word. Rigmarole, Keith, not rigmarole. Rigmarole. So I turn your attention back to sympathy and empathy. It's not a question of saying, young people today, they need to pull their socks up, they need to get a stiff upper lip, you just need to work hard and pull yourself together. You don't do that to people with physical ailments. You'd never say, and this isn't a conversation about mental health, it's just part of the issue that we're addressing here. You'd never say to someone with a broken leg, come on, you've got to run faster, would you? You'd never say to somebody with dodgy lungs that they just need to use positive mental attitudes in order to breathe more clearly. So quite why we come at young people in such a castigatory way, if that's a word, is a bit of a mystery to me. But I think it's easier than understanding. I think to see the world through the lenses of your own experiences and generation is a lot easier than saying, God, things are very, very different now. But that's what I want you to do. I want you to examine how different things are, particularly, perhaps, if you are the parent of someone in Generation Z and you kind of agree with them. So I don't really see the benefit in shouting at these people and telling them that they need to work harder and do more. Because when we worked harder and did more, we got a lot more in return. So I want to speak to you, obviously, if you are in Generation Z. So if you were born in 1997, you'd be 27 now, right? 27, 28. I should never do maths live on the radio. I'll never learn. 27, 28 now, if you were born in 97. And if you were born in 2012, you'd be 13 now. So that includes 13-year-olds, does it? Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, they're the ones that have missed school and stuff. So it's a fascinating cohort, but it's quite a big one. Born between 1997 and 2012, from the arrival of Tony Blair in Downing Street to the arrival of the Olympic torch in East London. And you know why people feel so much less optimistic. And you can tell me. But if you're the parent of one of these people, if you're the parent of one of these young people, then I want to know about the reality of that comparison. So it's not only about what the differences are, because we can count those, they're measurable, but I do want to hear from you about them. The fact that we are worse, so that you are worse off than your parents were. The fact that what's it like when your children are worse off than you? It's the one thing, and I haven't come up against this yet, but I suspect I'm going to. The nature of my crazy career is such that I've done better than my dad, but I don't know that my kids will do better than me. That there is I'm talking in purely financial terms, that was always a presumption for generations now. I think this might be the area of the conversation that interests me most, actually, but I certainly don't want to exclude the actual young people from the conversation. But for almost all of us, the abiding mission of parenthood is to leave our children better off than we were, to raise them higher than we managed to be. And that's not happening now. So conscious though I am of excluding Generation Z from the conversation and concentrating instead on their parents, that's my first question for you. What's it like to look at your kids and know, through no fault of their own, that they're not going to do as well as you, materially, in life. 0345 6060 973. And whichever side of the generational divide you're on, whether you're in the parents' cohort or whether you're in Generation Z, talk to me about what you think the biggest differences are. What, for example, do my generation not understand about your generation? So when you hear people talking about pulling your socks up or getting or working harder, what don't we get? What don't those usually slightly blowhardy types sitting in the question time audience, what don't they understand about the reality of your existence? What do you think the big differences are between being 25 in 2024, 25 in 2025 and 2025 in 1985 or 1995? What do you think the big differences are between your generation and theirs? And if you are a parent of someone in this cohort, what's that like? How do we process the knowledge that for the first time in the post-war period, most of us will not be leaving our children in a world where they will end up better off than we were? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. So why is Generation Z so unhappy? What are the major differences between that generation and the older ones? And crucially, as a parent, how do you process that knowledge that through no fault of their own, the social contract which saw you rise higher than your parents no longer exists? Sorry, I've gone on a bit on that, but sometimes that happens when I'm digging into stories that I hadn't dug into as deeply before. It's 20 minutes after 11. The phone lines are open.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 23 minutes after 11, and I like this from Nassim. Are we partly to blame, James, the parents of Generation Z? We are stuck in our ways because we believed that when we worked harder, we would go places and be better off, and we've kind of passed that on to them, even though it's no longer true. I don't know. That's why I don't know that we've done it this way around before. I am as interested in the views of parents of people in this cohort as I am in the experiences of people in this cohort. Let's start in Let's start in Maidenhead. Teresa is there. Teresa, what would you like to say?
Well, hi. Yeah, I'd just like to say I absolutely agree that our children don't have the opportunities we had, even though we work very hard to give our children those opportunities. You know, we've given them a good education. My eldest daughter went to university. She got a really good degree. And she's got a decent job, but she's not in the position I was in at her age, where I owned a house, was getting married, felt secure in my future, and I know that she doesn't.
Why doesn't she?
I think she knows that how difficult it's going to be to get on the housing ladder.
That's going to be the biggest thing, you think?
And a big university debt that she's to pay off.
Which we didn't have, really. We had student loans, but not...
I didn't. I got paid, I got a grant to go to university. I must have been one of the last years that did. And, massive opportunities that just don't exist anymore.
And she's on the right side of a lot of the problems that we're describing. She's in a job that she likes and getting paid a decent sum, but not enough to make enough inroads into her future that would give her a sense of security. Is that what we're describing?
Absolutely, and she's well aware of that, and she's spoken about that. She knows what the difficulty, and it's put us in a position where we feel that they're not going to succeed or certainly get to the level that we're at without our help. So
and that's measuring it.
She can't do it by herself.
And we're measuring that in exclusively financial terms, because in terms of professional status, I'm always struck by the salaries of journalists, because that's the world I know, Teresa. And you could rise, my children, for example, could rise to the level I was at the age of 28. And in real terms, they'd be on a very small proportion of what I was on, with the same job title and the same status. And that then translates into getting on the housing ladder and doing all of those things. So when we say succeed, we're really talking about how far your money goes in the modern world, the relationship between income and cost of living.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think as well, what it's translated into is, and it sounds like a harsh way to say it, but a little bit of malaise and an apathy towards their life situation that I didn't have. So I've feel like I've got the freedom to feel passionate about things which are not directly related to myself, like things like climate change.
Yeah.
I think my children struggle to care about stuff like that because they just see their own lives as being quite difficult and challenging.
Well, the answer to the question that every adolescent has asked, what's the point, is very different for their generation than it was for ours. We could come up with quite a few things. I mean, the stereotype has the younger generation as being more invested in environmental matters than the older generation. But you know, these are generalizations. And at some point, even if you were incredibly passionate in your teens, you get into your 20s and you see how seriously it's taken in the world. You see Donald Trump arriving in the White House shouting, "Drill, baby, drill." Yeah. Then you sort of throw your arms up in despair and think, well, there's not much point caring about that anymore either.
Well, and I think their answer to that is, what can I achieve? What can I do?
What difference can I make?
Exactly, and it sort of makes you feel like the world is going backwards.
What about, I mean,
many of those freedoms?
Yeah, well, it is going backwards. That's what we've been talking about in the first hour of the programme, although not on a micro level for people living in Britain in 2025. I'm going to crack on because there's so many people waiting, Teresa, and I can ask them the questions that I wanted to ask you because they'll have. But I am interested in whether it makes you more likely to want to move abroad or more likely to roll the dice, more likely to take big risks. I don't know. Dan's in Hampton. Dan, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I was just chatting to your colleague, and I was talking about my son. He's just doing his GCSEs at the moment.
Yeah.
And his aim, he came to me and says, well, actually, I just want to be a scuba diving instructor in Thailand. That's what he wants to do. And my initial reaction being sort of a generation of people who wanted to strive and get on and do things, I initially was like, what are you talking about? You've got to get out there and...
No son of mine. No son of mine.
Yeah, exactly. It was just hilarious.
Yeah.
But it's just like, hold on, but rationalise and think about it. They're in such a chaotic world now that they don't feel like they have a stake in anything. They just don't. But the upshot slightly for them is like, actually, do you know what? I'm going to go out and find something else.
That's what I was just thinking, talking to Teresa. I said it. I didn't know you were going to tell me this when you came on. And you've made me think of a phrase I haven't heard for a long time, Dan. And that phrase is dropping out. Because I don't know how old you are, probably a similar age to me, looking at how old your boy is. To us, what you've just described, we would have called that dropping out. Oh, he's dropping out. He's going off to Thailand to teach yoga or to be a scuba diving instructor. But dropping out of what?
No, exactly. What have we created for them to drop out of? And actually, if I reflect now and look at the state of the world as it is, I would drop out. Maybe I didn't have enough bravery to drop out and do it.
Or there was enough available to keep you in the game, as it were. In the, I don't want to say rat race, but in that, on the treadmill. Treadmill's a good way of it. Just enough reward to justify you being on the treadmill and being a little bit spooked by the thought of jumping off it.
Well, when I came out of uni, I came out of uni in '96. I went. There's so many opportunities and stuff of coming out of uni, jumping into jobs. I went into TV. The idea of that for them now is just not plausible. It just isn't plausible. It's so difficult. It's so competitive. And also you look at it and go, and he probably looks at me a little bit and goes, and what did you get from it? If I'm being, brutal about it. But
you're probably better off than your parents were.
Yes.
And that's the big change. He knows he probably won't be, even if, by your own account, you haven't accrued as much as you might have expected to. He expects to accrue even less.
Yeah, but I think he might be emotionally better off though in time.
Well, the fact you can say that
out loud.
And
because I think in some respects, I think that's something that's a positive to hang on to, is that maybe they're starting to look at stuff and thinking, do you know what? Other things like money, and we're talking about financial advancement, aren't we? We're talking about the idea that you're measured purely because you've got a house or you've done this and that. I think they start to view things differently. I don't think that's necessarily unhealthy, apart from the time when I reacted badly.
No, of course.
The truth is, maybe it is better.
I love this conversation, and I think your lad's lucky to have a dad who's not so set in his ways that he can't contemplate the possibility of the grass on the other side being, if not greener, then at least as green as the grass on this side. And the other thing you remind me of, talking about values and what you prioritise and what you think is valuable, it's very easy to get downcast by the statistics about young people seeking help for depression or other mental health issues. But that is a double-edged sword, because that means that more young people than ever before are talking about these things and coming forward to have these conversations and asking for help. Whereas, of course, in previous generations, and you can see this particularly among men of my age and older, the amount of emotional effort put into pretending that you're absolutely fine when you're obviously not is damaging to them and to everybody around them. In fact, if I was in a particularly, flagrant mood, I'd suggest that children desperately craving love and acceptance, the adults that they have turned into, have become the source of many of the problems in the modern world. But that's just a pet theory and probably not one for today. Here's Thomas Watts with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:35 is the time. Would you like to play true or false? So, is it true or false? An action plan from a prominent, albeit faded figure in the world of British politics from the last few years. Here it is. Shove out Kemi ASAP. Take over Tories. Get Trump/Elon to facilitate a merger with Reform. Tip in a third force, capital letters, of elite talent and mass energy, so voters see an essentially new political force whose essence is, italics, a decisive break, end italics, with 1992 to 2024. Is anyone else thinking of Molesworth at this? Do you remember Molesworth? I love Molesworth. Anyway, brackets, remember, voters keep voting for change, but the old parties keep refusing, close brackets. Break the coalition supporting Starmer. Take over number 10. Do regime change. Immediate action, vote reform in all local elections and help start the avalanche to remove KB, push what's falling. Go on, have a guess. Who's come out with that in the last couple of days? I shall take all of your suggestions in all of the usual ways. But back to the conversation about Generation Z. That was interesting, wasn't it? Talking to Dan about his lad wanting to hop off to Thailand and become a scuba diving trainer, which parents of my class and generation would consider to be failure or dropping out. But if I say to you, dropping out of what exactly? Perhaps you come to a better understanding in that moment of why this generation is unmotivated and unhappy. Adam's in Sutton. Adam, what made you pick up the phone?
I just wanted to talk about twofold. So the regards with young people and work, and then the mental health side of things as well. I think one thing that's very prevalent amongst a lot of people that I know, sort of a lot of my friends, is that we work hard. We work full-time jobs and we take on extra shifts. But it doesn't seem to matter what we do or how much we work. At the end of the day, when it gets to the end of the month, we're still struggling to get by. And that's just with normal bills. Without, some of us aren't paying rent. We don't have a mortgage because we don't have a house. And if I'm honest, I don't feel like I will ever be able to purchase a house. I feel like the outgoings now as a young person is extortionately high with, car insurance and just other things in general. We work really hard and we don't get anything back for it.
You're working really hard to stand still.
Yeah, it's like you cannot stop. I feel like I work myself to the ground most weeks, and at the end of the month I have nothing to show for it.
And if you didn't work yourself to the ground, what would happen?
I would fall behind
on payments.
On payments, yeah.
So you are. We are back to this. I know it's a bit simplistic, but this breaking your back to stand still. What's the point? The answer is because if I don't stand still, I sink.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.
Sorry, I think I just missed that last bit.
But if you don't stand still, you sink. So if you had a slightly different setup, if you were still living with your parents or if you didn't have a car, I can understand why people of your age facing what you've just described would think, well, actually, I'm not going to bother at all.
I mean, one thing that I heard a lot while I was studying at college was, why should I go out and work and get a job when I will never be able to buy a house?
Yeah.
When instead I can stay at home and claim benefits instead.
Yeah.
That's something that I heard a lot. I think on the flip side as well is that there's young people and mental health. is a big thing now. I've struggled with my mental health and depression for the last 6 years. I've been in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
Twice, because I had serious intentions of taking my own life.
Right.
And I had to wait 3.5 years to actually get to an agency that might be able to provide help for me and my mental health.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky in the sense that I've got a very supportive family and a very supportive girlfriend that will stand by me. It does make me wonder, people that don't have that are in slightly different situations to me, would they have taken their own life? And would things be different if this was 20, 30 years ago, when there was things in the community, there was support systems in place for us?
And yet there was a lot less conversation about mental health. I mean, it wasn't a sort of a rose-tinted era where everybody had immediate access to the kind of support that they needed. It was taken a lot less seriously, and yet in some ways your generation has got what could be construed as the worst of worlds, because you're emotionally literate enough to recognise what's happening to you, but you can't access the support that you need to, or you can't get the help that you need to properly address it. But what you describe is the difference between suffering alone and suffering in company, and suffering in company is always going to be a little bit easier than suffering alone, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what do you see on the road ahead? So how old are you now?
I'm 20.
And I suspect you're not doing a job that is linked to what you studied at college. Did you?
No, not at all.
But you expected when you were studying to deploy those skills in the workplace? Or not?
Yeah, that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
I was studying mechanical engineering at college.
Right.
Towards the midway through my college, I struggled with my mental health.
Right.
And I ended up taking some time off.
Yes.
And my intention is to return to some form of education in order to get a job within engineering. But then I'm forced that I have to make a decision of, do I carry on doing a mediocre job that I don't really like for the rest of my life, but the money's,
enough.
It's okay.
Just
it
enough.
pays
Just
what
enough.
I need to do.
Yeah.
Or do I take a massive financial hit and fall 4 to 6 years of not working full time to go to university? Because
with no guarantee of an improved circumstance at the end of it, but with the addition of some fairly significant debt. I don't envy you. I'm sorry for what you're going through. I really am, but I'm grateful to you for articulating it so clearly. If you're interested in what this old fart thinks, I would roll the dice. I'd take the risk, but it's so easy for me to say that when I'm not in the situation that you find yourself in. And I wonder if I'm sure someone cleverer than me has said this before, but the stability of a society is defined by what Adam has just described there, is that if you are on the treadmill and you think it's worth it, society is stable. If you are looking at the treadmill and thinking that it's not worth it, like some of the people he was at college with, then society can become unstable. And of course, as we should probably acknowledge, populists, demagogues, liars can flourish and thrive. So I do not be surprised if populists and liars are targeting this generation with unkeepable promises. A bit like Brexit in a way. The more dispossessed and disillusioned you are with the status quo, the more likely you are to use your vote just to sort of say, well, Yabu sucks to the status quo. I'm here for something new and something different and something that might signify change. But that I've never had that thought before. Whether you're going to take home ownership or not necessarily home ownership, because it's by no means all of the population. But stability, social stability, is about the rat race, the treadmill, call it what you will, delivering enough for you to think it's worth getting on it every morning. And if you are thinking that it's not worth it, but like Adam, you have to, then you are describing a recipe for unhappiness. And if you've decided it's not worth getting onto, and you're going to live at home and you're going to lead a desiccated existence, then you you become the other side of the same coin, the other part of the same problem. And it's all about whether or not it's worth getting on the treadmill. 0345 60 60 973. I'll read this from John. Because, of course, no one's suggesting for a minute that older people are all going to have lived lives of epic advantage and opportunity. But to suggest that it's tougher now than it was then, John, isn't an opinion. It's counting. But just for anyone else who's missed the point, here's John's description of suboptimal circumstances in 1981 when he left school in a post-industrial northern town. There were absolutely no jobs. It was an era of mass unemployment. It got worse up to 1984. By the time the economy started getting better in 1987, because I'd been unemployed for so long, there were no employers interested in me. Every generation has their own problems. You're absolutely right, mate. But every generation also has means and medians, averages and graphs. You can see the graph of home ownership through all the generations. You can see the graphs of income, the relationship between income and cost of living through all the generations. And I fully appreciate it that some people find it hard to swallow. Not just people who think they got a really rough deal back in the day, but also people who think that they didn't get that the really, really good deal they got was entirely as a consequence of their own hard work and attributes. They're the worst, that kind of boomer attitude that simply says, well, all you've got to do is eat fewer avocados or cancel your Netflix subscription. Just look at the numbers. It's a completely different universe, particularly in the context of home ownership. That shit might come back in again one day. I don't know. It's all about interest rates, isn't it? More than it is about income, for good or for ill. But Gary Stevenson, the economist who's done Full Disclosure, has a theory that the people who are kind of in the box seat now in the United States, there's nothing left to take from the poor. And so they're going to go after the middle class next. And if you think about the simple suggestion that there's nothing left to take from the poor, you kind of see the possibility that Gary's got that absolutely right. And then on a global scale, what you have happening now since Trump's election and since Elon Musk arrived in the Oval Office is you have the richest man in the world going after the poorest children on the planet and pretending that it's all about government efficiencies or a response to corruption. So I think normal people probably balk slightly at the historical evidence of utterly unparalleled greed, which is why I opened yesterday's show by telling you that I'd been thinking quite a lot about the dissolution of the monasteries. Take the man in the country who's got everything, by far the richest person in the country, and what's his top priority? Getting more. Where's he going to get it from? Well, the poor haven't got anything, so I'll go after the monks. The poor haven't got anything, so we'll go after the middle. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. It's probably not helpful. It's 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10 to 12. Can I tell you what I'm tempted to do in the next hour? But I think it might be a bit unprofessional. I'm looking. I know it doesn't normally stop me, Keith, but you don't have to say that out loud. I'm looking again at the Rachel Reeves story about her expenses, not about her LinkedIn profile, which may or may not have been filled in by someone else. And I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the BBC has concerned itself with this story. I genuinely can't. But that could easily, look, for the avoidance of doubt, that WhatsApp group that broke while I was away, that was gross. I like the way that Starmer moves very quickly with people like that, who are just doing things that came to seem normal under the Tories, but are not normal. They're disgusting. And the fella that lamped someone, it's absolutely right that he's gone. No one would be defending him in a million years. With this, I don't know, unless there's some massive smoking gun that hasn't come out yet. I can't help thinking that the BBC have put teams on Rachel Reeves's CV, partly because they've done what Kemi Badenoch does and started treating Twitter as a reliable, or thinking that Twitter is still a reliable news source. Kemi Badenoch standing up in the, what did she do? She asked Starmer if he was going to resign, didn't she, a few weeks ago? Because of something that was on X. And then this week she got something out of the Daily Telegraph about some fella who's been working in Finland and thought that she'd got a massive zinger. Did you hear that clip that I played from PMQs? She thought she'd got a massive zinger. Because the bloke who, you can really hear the Kidderminster in me when there's a g at the end of a word, can't you? She thought she'd got a massive zinger because there's some bloke who's going to be in charge of our borders and he thinks he's going to be working from Finland. So she hits Keir Starmer over the head with that. Keir Starmer stands up and says, actually, He's been in a senior role since 2019, when you lot were in power, and he's been working from Finland since then. But if we give him this job now that you're talking about, we're going to insist that he works in the UK. I don't know what's the opposite of a zinger, a bazinga, a ginza, a ginster. I don't know, but that's what happens when you. And I think the BBC might have just bought into all of that brouhaha. That very manufactured brouhaha about Rachel Reeves's LinkedIn profile and her expenses in a job for a bank nearly 20 years ago. But they've put so much on it. You've put a producer on it. You've put a reporter on it. You've got the political editor commenting on it. They can't just go, oh, well, that was a waste of time. Well, my late father taught me that some of the most important journalism never sees the light of day. You put months into investigating something and it turns out there was nothing there. So it never sees the light of day. Maybe the BBC so sort of, I don't know, reduced these days. Well, we're going to have to go to screen with this. But what's the accusation? She bought a handbag. She bought a handbag on expenses. Did it get cleared on it? Yes. Well, of course it got cleared. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about it. How do you know she claimed for a handbag on expenses? Well, because we can see she claimed for a handbag on expenses. How do you know she claimed for it? Did she hide it? Did she lie? No, obviously, if we wouldn't know she'd claimed for a handbag on expenses. So what's the story? Well, they're investigating, are they? Yeah. What happened with the don't know. Nothing. So did she get fired? No. Was she told off? No. Did she know she was being investigated about her purchases on expenses in the private sector long before she became a politician? Did anyone tell her she was being investigated? Well, apparently not, no. So what's the story again? She bought a handbag on expenses, boss. What's the story again? And how much have we spent on this? Well, we've had 3 people on it for 6 months. Christ, you better go on Newsnight tomorrow then, otherwise how are we going to justify this to the accounts department? Which is kind of ironic when you think about it. So again, I categorically accept I could be wrong. And if you were kind enough to listen to this programme back in the day, I went after Labour MPs during the expenses scandal even harder than I went after Tory MPs, because I always think naively that Labour people should look after public money even more than every other politician should as well. I had a couple of Labour politicians who I was like a rat up a drain pipe over their expenses claims. There's another element to this story, isn't there? 10 years ago, are you ready for this? 19 MPs had their official credit cards suspended by the Parliamentary Expenses Watchdog because they couldn't show that all of their spending was valid. And Rachel Reeves was one of them. How many of the other 18 can you name? Go on, I'll wait. What? None of them? Why not? Well, because it was 10 years ago, James, and it's not important. Otherwise, you'd know all night. You better list them like that. Like you can Nadeem Zahawi's Stables or the fellow with the duck house or that. And she paid it back. So there was about $4,000 at the time of the suspension, which she then paid back. And she'd have had to pay it back anyway. But she then paid it, so it's been paid back. So what's the story again? She bought a handbag in 2012? No, not 20, but even before that. She bought a handbag at some point between 2006 and 2009, and she claimed for it on expenses. And we've spoken to one of her former employees who said that they had a cavalier attitude regarding the budget in the department. Have you ever... So anyway, I'm digressing slightly. The conversation I'd quite like to have in the next hour, but I don't know if I can, is going to be about absolutely hilarious expenses claims. And that's something Generation Z will know absolutely nothing about. The idea that you work for someone and there was so much money sloshing around that you could put in claims. There was a gentleman on the Evening Standard when I started on Fleet Street. The legend was he'd managed to put a son through Eton on bogus expense claims. Like meals that he hadn't eaten or contacts that he hadn't paid off and tips that he hadn't paid for. He trousered all the cash himself and managed to put a son through Eton. I don't know why I think that's somehow relevant to the broader conversation that we're having, but it is. Anyway, back to Generation Z and the reasons for a lack of motivation and a lack, sadly, of happiness. Ella is in Alton. Sorry, Ella, I went off on a bit of an unexpected tangent. What did you want to say?
That's okay. I actually got quite emotional listening to your last caller because I think that's really important. And I've had a similar situation. I mean, I suffered with my mental health from when I was really young, and I think the state of the services, I've been able to watch that decline over the past 22 years of my life. And that's really a massive deal. But I think something that's really important as well is, and I know people blame things on social media all the time, but the ubiquity of information that we have at our fingertips, it's non-stop, 24-hour news. And not only are you aware of, so for me, the way it plays out in my mind, I guess, is that I learn about, I'm up on current affairs, and I'm actually back at university in first year now, so I will recommend to that caller that 100% if you can manage to find a way to go back into education and just take that leap, it's it really does. I would always recommend that. But even now, and I'm lucky enough to be able to live with my parents when I do that, which a lot of people aren't in that position. And I've kind of resolved myself to the fact that I'm probably not going to be owning a house unless I just never see that in my future. But for me, it's this idea that the more I learn about the world that we're living in, how can you get up in the morning and think, oh, this is great, even after everything you've been talking about today?
But that was. I think we had a period of. It was Harold Wilson who said you've never had it so good. I'm too young for that to register. But if you lived in that period that I grew up in, you didn't realise how lucky you were. And we had the Cold War. The Cold War used to keep children awake at night. But my generation just kind of came in towards the end of that period. And you had that 20-year window where we'd hear about the ozone layer, but we didn't really understand what it was. I think there was even a kids' TV program called The Ozone, which shows just how seriously we were taking it at that. Whereas you look everywhere. You look and you see instability or peril or danger.
Exactly, yeah. And obviously I'm a mature student, and so I'm with first years now. And something I was talking to one of my lecturers about the other day is that I get really, really frustrated by the lack of knowledge amongst people in terms of, because there's this tendency to kind of shut off and just consume yourself in your own world and just look through TikTok. But for me, the more I learn, sort of talking about America and stuff like that at the moment, it's absolutely terrifying. And there is so much in the world that is just,
and the temptation to switch off grows exponentially.
Exactly.
And you'd almost advise people to do it. It was Macmillan, I think, who said you've never had it so good. But you'd almost advise people to turn it off for their own mental health.
Exactly, and that shuts you off from being able to learn and find a place. And sort of Alice Campbell's book, But What Can I Do?
Yes.
I think he kind of highlights this issue really well, in that sense of powerlessness that young people feel.
You're absolutely right.
And that idea that there's just, so say I wanted to go into politics or activism or anything like that, not only is there so many things up against me in terms of the route to get there, but there's also all of the financial things, okay, none of these jobs are going to pay anything really to start with, and then how do I then pay for rent, which is ridiculous and extortionate, and everything you do and see just feels impossible to overcome.
Out of reach.
Why not?
Beyond, and yet you're hanging in there and plugging away. And, patronising though I will sound, I really, really wish you well. I also, thanks to you and other callers this hour, understand why people don't. And you need to get to that understanding before you can properly address economic inactivity. So it doesn't matter how hard you crack the whip or how much benefits you cut or whatever it is. If people are not motivated to get onto the treadmill because there's no point getting on the treadmill, then they're not going to get on the treadmill. And pick your own metaphor. It doesn't have to be a treadmill. It could be a ladder. It could be anything. But there it is. That's the single most important issue facing society on some levels, I think, that we ever talk about on the programme, which is why we talk about it quite a lot, and we'll, moving forward, talk about it more. It is 12:01.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Does it happen outside journalism? I don't think we can get an hour out of it. And I use this word advisedly, there's a beautiful story about obsessive compulsive disorder in the news that I think we will discuss together, because OCD is probably one of the most misunderstood conditions under the sun. And an actress called Tuppence Middleton, what a beautiful name, has done more work in the space of, she's written a book, I think, about her experiences, but some of the newspapers have picked up on it. And she's arguably done more in that tiny window to enhance and improve understanding of this issue and this condition than anybody else that I can think of off the top of my head. It's so misunderstood. So we may get on, we're definitely getting onto that, so be aware. What a beautiful writer she is as well. Absolutely. But I like the Rachel Reeves story today for all the wrong reasons. I like it. A, because I cannot for the life of me work out what I'm supposed to be cross about. Make of that what you will. But I also like it because it reminds me of one of the finest topics of conversation among newspaper journalists of a certain age, of which I'm very much at the younger end. This was coming to an end, very much coming to an end, when I finally got my foot in the door of Fleet Street. But the legend still persisted, and the creativity with which some people put their expenses claims together was off the charts. There's a big distinction to be made here between public sector and private sector. If you are exaggerating, even fiddling your expenses in the public sector, then you're stealing from the taxpayer. If you are fiddling or being creative with your expenses in the private sector, then you're stealing from your boss, which means that nobody who's ever taken home some Post-it notes or some coffee capsules or some, I don't know, staples is allowed to criticise or condemn. But I don't know if it happens outside other professions. I don't think it does it? Well, I mean, you do a lot of entertaining, don't you? Do a lot of hospitality when you're in the city. The two stories I most remember from that area, the one I've already told you, there was a chap who was reputed to have put his son through Eton College on non-existent entertainment expenses when he was on the London Evening Standard. When I first started, I was selling suits on Regent Street, and I got a few shifts on a variety of diaries or gossip columns, as they're more popularly known. And I think I just missed the days when the petty cash office at the London Evening Standard on High Street, Kensington, would have a little queue outside it every morning where you could go in and just get cash. And although you would normally need a receipt, you could say, I tipped off. I paid someone for a story tip. And all you had to do was provide evidence of the story, whether you'd paid someone for it or not. You'd say, I gave him 10 shillings. And they'd just hand you the cash in the morning and just put it in your pocket. So I missed all of that. But I didn't miss the time that a trattoria in Glasgow closed. And it was just around the corner from the Daily Express offices in Glasgow, where Mrs. O'Brien actually cut some of her journalistic teeth, and this story was still told in hilarious tones. So there was a trattoria that everybody went to, right? Or every day they'd be in there, people from the paper, and sometimes they'd be entertaining contacts, and sometimes they'd just be getting leathered and sticking it all on expenses, as you put everything on expenses in that era. And the trattoria closed down, and I don't know why. The younger generation didn't want to take over the restaurant or whatever the reason was. But when the trattoria closed down, the journalists on the Express up in Glasgow got hold of the bills. These were in the days, for younger listeners, when the bills were handwritten. When you were brought the bill at the end of your meal in a restaurant, it had been written out by hand. It hadn't even, been put through a till in the traditional sense. And this isn't 100 years ago. This is in my working lifetime. You'd have a bill that was handwritten. And they got hold of a box of pads of bills. And you can work out the rest of the story, right? So they continued to submit expenses claims down to HQ in London. They continued to submit expenses claims for meals that they claimed to have eaten in a restaurant that was now closed. And this went on for years. I mean, they had pads. They had a box of pads to get through. And I think, I don't know how the story ended, whether they ran out of bills or whether, I think that there was an audit. and a managing editor. I love this version of the story. In fact, let's say this is the true version of the story, right? The managing editor or the deputy managing editor goes up to Glasgow to do an audit on the financial situation of the office. And at some point he says, "Good Lord, you lot go to La Rosetta a lot, don't you? You like La Rosetta. I think I'm going to go there for lunch today." And you can imagine the feeling that went around the office. Oh, God. So they've been submitting invoices from La Rosetta 4-5 years after the place closed. And the managing editor is sitting there saying, someone's going to... And I think that's how... Did I pronounce it wrong? How do you pronounce it? Trattoria? What did I say? Why is everyone having a go at my Italian pronunciation? What did I say? It's an Italian restaurant. Is it? Well, I don't know if it was a trattoria. Is it it could be an osteria, trattoria. Look, it was an Italian. It was a spaghetti house. It wasn't. That's a flipping brand name, isn't it? It was an Italian restaurant. I was trying to sound all trattoria. I don't know. Anyway, you live and learn. I'm sorry. People are so critical and pedantic sometimes, honestly. So, the managing editor is there and says, "Well, you lot go to La Rosetta a lot. I think I'll pop there for my lunch today." And that's how the gaff got blown. So no more bills could be submitted from a restaurant that had been shut for 3 or 4 years. But I do not know. Can someone Italian just give me a quick ring and tell me how to pronounce this word? Otherwise, it's going to bother me all day. And then I need my phone lines back for the proper phone-in that we're going to have. So can I need a proper Italian? We'll check your passport and just tell me how I pronounce that word. It's one of those words I've only ever seen written down. There's a word for that as well, for words that you've only ever seen written down, so you don't know how to pronounce them. But when would you ever have pronounced it? You're never going to say, "Shall we visit a local trattoria, Keith?" You just say, "Shall we go to that place?" I don't know what the word is for that, but someone told me there's a word for when you've only ever seen a word written down, you don't therefore know how to pronounce it. I was like that with anchovy for a long time. I thought it was pronounced anchovy, as you would, right? Because you come across the word anchor, but you'd never come across an anchovy. So the first time you saw the anchovy. So get that out of the way, all right? 0345 6060 973. Someone Italian to tell me how to pronounce that word, and then we'll move on quickly, all right? And if you really want to go to the top of the class, then I want the question of what is the word for something when you've only ever seen a word written down and therefore you don't know how to pronounce it. You can win a prize for that, all right? But first of all, have we got an Italian on the line now? Can we do this, please? Because I've got a phone-in to do. This is a radio phone-in program. I can't dedicate much more time to my mispronunciation of Italian words. Stop ringing me, Italians. No more Italians, please. I've got what I need. Cristiano is in West Drayton. Cristiano, over to you.
Hi, James. It's Trattoria.
Trattoria?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, God, I didn't even get close to that. Trattoria. Hang on, I'm just going to get a second opinion. Have we got a second opinion?
Second opinion?
Yes, I need a second opinion.
Me, I'm Italian.
Where are you from?
Sardinia.
I'm going to get a second opinion from Sabina. Sabina, over to you.
Trattoria.
Where are you from, Sabina?
Shepherd's Bush.
Well, okay. Trattoria, and we put Sabina on air so quickly that she hadn't even been told to switch her radio off. Thank you, Sabina. Cristiano?
Yes, James.
Grazie mille.
Grazie a te. Ciao, James.
Ciao, Cristiano. There you go. Trattoria. So anyway, there was this... Have I told you the story about the Trattoria in Glasgow where all the Daily Express channel... I'll tell you another time. I like that. But I don't think it happens in other professions, so I don't think we can get a phone in out of it, which means that we will take calls on the reality of obsessive-compulsive disorder, one of the most misunderstood, I think, conditions on the under the sun, and one which an actress called Tuppence Middleton has written about, in a story that has been serialised, I think, in the Times. And she's written about it with such disarming clarity and beauty that I thought we'd dedicate what's left of the programme today to the reality of living with real obsessive-compulsive disorder. I don't mean... Because I've got a confession to make. I didn't used to understand this. And I used to think it... Not funny, but I think we did a phone-in once because I had this thing where I always needed the radio to be on an even number on the volume. And we did a phone-in years ago about little things like that, like a lady who always needs her mugs in the right row. We are categorically not talking about that today, all right? What we will be talking about after the break is what this wonderful woman describes as devious, nimble little beasts that have occupied my head for the best part of 30 years. A cerebral itch, impossible to scratch. They wield their own special power over my brain, shaping the architecture and the rhythm of my thoughts. We're going to talk about what that is like after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:17 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And I want to have a conversation now about the seriousness. I know it's Friday and we sometimes do something lighthearted on Fridays, but there is nothing lighthearted about this. It's a book written by an actress called Tuppence Middleton, who you may know from Downton Abbey. And she has written about OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, and she's written about the way in which it can, or it does, constantly threaten to overwhelm her. I'm going to read some of what she's written to you, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me your equivalent experiences. So one of the most obvious is the ritual of locking a door. Close and lock the front door. Pull at the door handle for a count of 8 to make sure it is firmly closed. Push against the door for a count of 8 to make sure it can't be pushed open. Pull the door for a count of 8. Push the door for a count of 8. Pull the door for a count of 8. Push the door for a count of 8. You're tired listening to this, right? You're exhausted just hearing what she puts herself through, what she has to go through just to get out of the house. Pull the door for a count of 8, push the door for a count of 8. Continue until I am satisfied it is closed. And she writes, ritual must be completed very rapidly and quietly to avoid arousing suspicion that I am either breaking into a house that isn't mine or losing my marbles. This is one of the bravest things I think I have ever written. She talks about a mind full of scorpions. In fact, I think the book is called Scorpions. My mind is full of scorpions. Must try and get her on full disclosure, actually. I'd love to speak to her more about her whole life, not just this, but that's what the book directs attention towards. They answer to another name, she writes, this nest of scorpions, obsessive compulsive disorder. It's leaving the house that presents me with the biggest challenge. In the midst of my obsessive thought cycles, I might send a quick message to my agent, friend, family member to say I'm running late. Transport issues, I'll say. Then I start my counting to 8 routine again. The message will have broken my cycle of concentration, and it is as if my short-term memory has been instantaneously erased. I'll put my bag down defeatedly and start my mental count as I look at the various enemies occupying my kitchen, door, tap, cooker, fridge, light switch. She takes photographs, an online photo album, forever in a state of full capacity because of what she describes, again, beautiful phraseology, the excess of mundane domestic photography I insist on housing there. So she has to take photographs of doors, ovens, locks, fridges, windows, lamps, candles, plug sockets, so that she can then consult her photographs to reassure herself that they are off or in the condition that she wants them to be in. I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking and, as I've said, incredibly brave. She talks about emetophobia, which is a fear of vomiting or seeing others being sick. She hadn't heard the word until she was 20 years old, but when she did hear it, she was relieved and shocked to learn that not only was I among other people in the world suffering from this phobia, but also that it was a legitimized fear. No one likes to vomit, but for a small proportion of people, an estimated 0.1% of the population, with women being 4 times more likely to suffer than men, the terror associated with catching a virus that might cause you to vomit can begin to influence the way in which you think and how you go about living your life. Absolutely extraordinary writing. And then some bullet points. What is the problem? Shaking hands. Always ensure that both hands are accidentally full or eradicate any need for the shake by preempting a greeting with an enthusiastic close-range wave. Unfamiliar toilets. Solution: touch all handles, taps and surfaces only with a hand covered by an item of clothing, a sleeve, a scarf, the hem of a dress. If possible, send in a friend first and ask for a review. Gosh. Problem, children's parties. Solution, avoid entirely. Unless the party is celebrating your own child, don't risk the finger buffet. Problem, supermarket self-checkout. Solution, assess health of the checkout operator. If healthy, go to them instead. If peaky, press options on screen with least used knuckle, e.g. fourth finger, right hand, never fingertip. And on it goes. A curious mixture of revelatory and heartbreaking and beautiful. A rogue blob of tomato sauce has fallen from my pizza onto the bed. I should probably clean it up, but I don't really have the energy after the marathon I have just endured. And there's so much blood saturating the sheets, I'm not sure there is any point. I have just given birth. It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. And it makes a bit of a mockery of the question with which we punctuate this programme, don't we, on a regular basis. What was it like? She's written in with unstinting clarity about what it is like. I guess, understandably, some newspapers today have picked up on the slightly, quotes, weird, end quotes, or weirdest, end quotes, elements of the story, where she imbues inanimate objects with personalities. So she can't leave crisps on the floor because they may be lonely. That's the angle that the Daily Mail chooses to go in on, somewhat disappointingly, but it's nowhere near as irresponsible a piece as something similar would have been 20 years ago. Since I was very young, I have awarded all inanimate objects with human feelings. If I drop a crisp on the floor by accident, rendering it too dirty to eat, I will either drop another so that it's not on its own, or split the existing crisp into two so that there are an even number of crisps on the floor. I don't want that crisp to feel lonely. As I say, it's unfortunate the Mail has elected to pick a bit that is clearly designed to make you laugh at her or think she's daft. But the bulk of the reporting and all of the serialisation in the Times and the purpose of the book is much more serious. So, how does it work with you? And we'll start with the equivalent experiences, the comparable experiences, the ritual of not being able to get out of the house, what Tuppence Middleton describes as a cerebral itch, impossible to scratch. And you listen to her describe what happens when she drops a crisp on the floor, and you don't do what the Daily Mail wants you to do, which is to snigger or to sort of sneer. You just go, oh, you poor thing, I know exactly what that's like. I know exactly what that's like. Why do you know exactly what that's like? 0345 6060 973. It's striking, writes this texter, that in context, every thought is irrefutably logical. in the sense that you want to know that your door is locked. You want to know that your oven is off. I don't know about lonely crisps being irrefutably logical, but once it's in your head and is bothering you and has become a cerebral itch impossible to scratch, then of course you're going to have to act on it. I find this absolutely fascinating. I really do, and I hope we can have a responsible conversation about it. What impact does it have, has it had, will it have on your life? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Tassir is in East Dulwich. Tassir, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning, James. I just wanted to relate my experience. I have two sons, both Gen Z as it happens. I'm talking about the older one here who had OCD, has OCD. It's a never-ending condition. And I think what I phoned in mainly for was to convey the importance of recognizing it early and getting help early. He had it in those ways that you described about the repetitious stuff, but that's just kind of the surface of it. It's the internal, the ruminations, the dark thoughts, that really is the the part that eats away at one.
Can I ask how you spot, as dad, how you and how parents, when did you begin to suspect that something was different with your boy?
Well, from when he was very young, when he was a toddler, and it was the things of touching things repeatedly, having to touch things. If he picked up a cake, he'd have to touch it 3 or 4 times before he picked it up. Then.
Did you ask him? I'm going to interrupt you a lot, because this is one of those areas where it's your second, that you know everything about this, but most of us know nothing. So did you say to him, why do you have to touch that cake so much?
Partly, I think we just thought it was just a thing, just a funny thing, that it wasn't, it was nothing serious. It was just a funny thing. We didn't know a lot about it at the time.
Of course.
And even the experts didn't know a lot about it at the time. And we started, when we'd walk in a park, for example, and you'd see somebody across the park with a disability or with something unusual about them, he would look and look back again.
Right.
And it was only later we understood that what he felt was a responsibility for that, for the predicament that this other person was in. He felt a responsibility for that, and I'll never forget. And I still speak to him about this. That is part of his character. That when we would give him toys.
Hey, it's all right. Take the time. All the time you need.
We'd give him toys.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
It's okay.
And if it was a broken toy, he wouldn't let us take it back, because he was worried nobody else would look after the toy.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
So to this day, he's like that, and to this day, it's like that in terms of relationships, and so it's tormenting him, and it continues to torment him, and in the relationships that he has and the ruminations that occur within his mind, and it's just. Okay, I'm not sure I can carry on. But
well, then I don't want you to. I don't want you to do anything you're not comfortable with. But you've conveyed quite perfectly, if I may say so, to see that combination of exhaustion, but also an excess of compassion, if such a thing is possible. I think that's what you've described.
Yeah, I think the important thing that what I called up about was to convey the importance of recognizing it early. I mean, we've just continued to learn about all of these things in the last sort of handful of years, and just in the last couple of years, things have happened in his relationships that I'm kind of thankful for. They're really drastic, they're dramatic, they're awful, but I'm sort of thankful for as well, in that we get to understand and recognize fully what he's having to go through, and he's sharing it with us now, and we can help him, because it puts you in the darkest of places.
And that's why your call is so important today, to helping other people understand what this condition is like, and it's why this book by Tuppence Middleton is I think likely to be a real game changer for families who are yet to go through what you and your family have been through.
Yeah.
Because knowledge is power, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just say one other thing. My younger son, who doesn't have that, he has other sort of stuff like ADHD, and we knew about it early. We addressed it early. He knows about it early. We have strategies to deal with it, and he grew up in and around my gelateria. So I think gelato has the magic.
How do you pronounce that?
Gelato. Gelateria. Sorry, gelateria.
Gelateria, okay. Gelateria. Oh, you mean as in trattoria? In the same. I see.
There is a magic to gelato, and I'll leave it at that. But it is a serious point. I am doing a project with kids around gelato and talking therapies around gelato. So,
I like that. I like that a lot. I'd look forward to finding out more about it. Tassia, thank you. And you touched a lot of people. You don't need me to tell you that. But your call so clearly, your comments, and indeed your tears so clearly came from a place of love that it would be impossible not to be moved by what you describe. The reason why Tassia refers to the treatments and the recognition that there are things you can do about it. Cognitive behavioural therapy can make enormous differences, although in Tuppence Middleton's case, she reports that it didn't work for her. But I guess the sooner you start looking for mechanisms, coping mechanisms, I don't know if cure would be the right word in this context, the sooner you start, the better chances you have. 12:32 is the time. Amelia Cox is here with your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:35 is the time. It's horribly overused. I don't know how. As with so much of the conversation surrounding offence, it's about intent and context, isn't it? You use a word unintentionally causing hurt to others. But when you know that it's hurtful and you continue to use it, or indeed insist that it's freedom of speech, you move into slightly different territory. So I don't hold particular animosity towards people who say, oh, it's all a bit OCD, or it's gone a bit OCD, or I'm a bit OCD, when they don't mean obsessive compulsive disorder. They mean a slightly excessive attention to detail, or they mean that they like to have all their ducks in a row. But it's not for me to say whether that is hurtful or not. If you suffer from what Tassia described in the last call, and what Tuppence Middleton writes about quite incredibly in her new book Scorpions, then the levels of exhaustion, the sheer draining of energy from you that is taken up by what she describes as these itches, these cerebral itches that are impossible to scratch, or indeed these scorpions crawling through her mind. I don't know who gets to decide how offensive it is to use the phrase in sort of casual shorthand for, sorry, I just smacked my microphone quite hard, casual shorthand for just, as I say, pedantry or attention to detail. John's in Dulwich. John, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello, John.
Hi there. I was diagnosed 19 years ago, but realistically, I'm 53 now. Right. Realistically, I've had it since I was about 14 or 15. I suffer with intrusive thoughts.
Right.
So mine's not so much about going, I need to check that door handle and keep, locking the shutters. There's various different forms of it. Mine, I'll get this image or thought in my head that I could be, for example, walking on a tube platform, and I might suddenly get this image in my head. Oh my God, I could push that person onto the track. And then what I do is I deliberately, obviously, move completely away, because nothing worse than I could think of actually doing that. And of course, once I've had that thought, I'll then be like, oh my God, have I actually done it? And that's where sometimes you have the checking part, and I might get out of the tube station. I might have to go back in and come back round and check again.
So this is the difference, because a lot of people listening will think, well, I have weird thoughts in the tube station, or I sometimes think about, but you think you've done something, or you fear you might have done. That's the intrusive nature of the thought, as opposed to just a thought. Yes, exactly.
And so basically, I know deep down that I would never have. Absolutely no way I would do anything like that. Nothing that awful. But I can't explain the rush of.
You are doing.
I wouldn't say adrenaline. Like when you're really the stress, my stomach will go knotted.
Yes.
I'll feel hot. I'll feel cold, and then I'll be really beating myself up, going. And then of course, once I know I haven't done that, I'll be then thinking, why have I thought that? I must be such an awful. How could I even think such a dreadful thing?
Yes.
I've got numerous examples, but the impact it's had on me. I've got the condition under control now. I've had lots of CBT over the years.
Brilliant.
But give you an example. I have been to India with business travel, and I went quite happily back into 2009, 2013. 2014, I went to go and get on the plane, or actually went to check in. This was in January 2014. I was going there with work, And I would literally just could not do it because the anxiety, because I thought, oh my God, what happens if I go to India and I somehow, oh my God, I could kill someone by accident, or something mad could happen, and I'd end up in like the Delhi Hilton, like, you know, the prison or whatever, and that'll be my life. And I know it sounds absolutely bonkers and completely irrational, and it's never going to happen, but
it's completely rational in your head, and it's completely plausible, and it's completely possible, and possibly even inevitable.
Yeah. I actually flew in 2016. I made it out to India, only to get there, to get into the hotel, burst into tears.
Oh, mate!
And I was on the flight. I was on the flight home the next morning, and the Virgin crew, when I got on the, what are you doing here? Yeah. So I've probably got one of the records for the shortest time ever.
Shortest visit to India ever. You mentioned that you were diagnosed in 2006, so you were in your 30s, were you? But before you got,
I was. But I mean, it's interfered with my life because the other thing is, it's not just been intrusive thoughts about that. Previously, I guess I had a fear of, oh my God, have I touched that bit of paper? Oh, it might have a bit of blood on it. Oh my God, have I got like, you know, I don't know, Hep C or some infectious disease? And that'll be it. And like and it was like literally, I'd be worried unbelievably for days on end, and then eventually I'd become literally. I have had it where it's been really severe. I mean, at my worst, admittedly, there was something else going on in my life. I'd lost a child, but in 2006, I couldn't actually go. I couldn't actually go out of the house for about 2-3 months, and I had my young daughter, who was only 2 at the time, and even going over the park was a big challenge. So, I mean,
but you got there. You got.
Yeah, I know. People sort of say, "Oh, it's, you know."
Not on this show, mate. Not on this show. They don't.
I mean, I don't get annoyed, but I do get a little bit annoyed because it has absolutely.
People don't realise. People don't realise how serious it is because they haven't heard stories like yours. They haven't heard stories like Tassir's, and they haven't heard stories like Tuppence Middleton. Can I tell you something? Do you mind?
No, go for it.
So, this doesn't happen to me very often at work, but it felt when you came on that you. It's almost like like a cork has just blown out of a bottle, and once you started talking, you had a hell of a lot more to say than you realised when you rang in.
I could go on for another 10 minutes quite easily. I've only told you literally the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it really,
But the CBT has worked for you.
Anyone out there, and anyone who gets these strange, bizarre thoughts.
Yes.
Trust me. I mean, I've had a lot of CBT. You're not mad, even if you. Generally, if you're worrying whether you're mad, that probably indicates you're not.
There's a whole book about that's Catch-22, isn't it? The Joseph Heller novel. I think that's exactly the point of the. Go on.
You know, I mean, I don't know, but my therapist, and I'm not going to make any judgments here.
No, of course.
I went to a Catholic school. She did mention that sometimes people who've been to religious school. I'm not actually religious now, but maybe the whole,
guilt,
drummed into you about being, a good person. Guilt
all the bloody time. Tell me about it.
And that's definitely
going to go to hell. All of that. So anyway, you have not only provided us with some sparkling insights, by which I just mean crystal clear insights into what it's like, but also the notion of there being light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you so much for calling today, John. I really, really appreciate it, and I know a lot of other people listening will as well, because it's like everything else, isn't it, where there's room for confusion. We need light. You need to shine light. It's why this book is such a remarkable contribution to public discourse. I'll read some of the text coming in just to drive home the point I've made. Mackie says, it's not spoken about enough, James. It affects many more people than you'd think. Kevin says, these callers are brilliant, so brave, sharing these experiences of true OCD. It can also be known as a doubting disorder, says Mike. And Nassim says, thank you so much for calling. And another book recommendation by an author called David Adam Nathan tells us, The Man Who Couldn't Stop is a fantastic insight into OCD and the author's own struggle. And I'd read this from Jim as well, because it's not just about people who have a relationship with the condition. It's about people like me who want to know more about it. This is an unexpectedly compelling and emotional hour of radio, James. Thanks so much for shining the light onto this and sending love to your wonderful callers.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:47 is the time. I get it, but full disclosure is back. What do you mean you hadn't even noticed it had gone? It's the first one of the year, I think, we're putting out today. And it's slightly relevant, or not even slightly, it is relevant to the conversation that we've been having about OCD, about obsessive compulsive disorder. But it's relevant to the things that aren't OCD, the behaviours that you want to change in your own life, but which you haven't been able to change unaided. And it's an interview with a doctor whose new book, Make Change That Lasts, 9 Simple Ways to Break Free from the Habits That Hold You Back, stormed to the top of the Sunday Times bestseller list at the beginning of this year. And I mean, it probably gets filed under self-help, which is a genre I'm normally quite wary of or suspicious of, but it's an incredible book. It's a beautiful book, and he's an amazing man. I speak, if you don't know already, of Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, who has a brilliant podcast and writes and is a doctor, and who draws on all of those things, and he's regularly popping up on the telly. Indeed, it says here, as seen on Lorraine. They'll soon add, as heard on Full Disclosure with James O'Brien. It's a really good chat, this. I know that you'll enjoy it. And I'm going to play you a little clip now, but I'm also going to tell you that I'm going to give you a hook and tease on a podcast that you haven't listened to yet. About 45 to 50 minutes into this conversation, I suddenly realised, I'm going to tell you this in case you listen to it. From about 10 minutes in, I started thinking, I hadn't met Rangan before, and I kept thinking, you really remind me of someone, and it's driving me nuts. I hate it when this happens in an interview scenario, because I get a bit distracted by it. It's a very, very, very mildly intrusive thought, which means I'm not thinking about what my next question is going to be, and I'm not listening as closely to what's being said to me as much as I could, because I'm trying to work out, and then I can stop, I can switch it off and get on with the episode. Who is it that he reminds me of? And I want you to do the same now when you listen to this podcast. You can download it from Global Player or all the usual places, because it suddenly hit me, and I tell him who it is. So he is working in the field of mental health, or in the field of stress, happiness, calmness, with a missionary zeal that reminded me of somebody quite unexpected. And it's not in the clip, is it? I don't think it's in the clip. I hope it's not in the clip. Otherwise, I've just completely blown the hook. No, it's definitely not in the clip. But I want you to. I'm going to give you that as a sort of Easter egg, as they say in the land of video games. But here is a little clip from this week's Full Disclosure interview with Dr. Rangan Chatterjee.
In January, I would say many people, whether you're into health or not, are trying to reset. And there's maybe some behaviors that they engage with, maybe too much alcohol, maybe too much sugar, maybe too much time scrolling Instagram in the evening, online pornography, whatever it might be. People are trying to reset. And I've said
because they know.
They know on some level that there's something slightly off, and January the 1st seems to be a good way of bringing it all home, going, right, this year. So why is it that 80% of these New Year's resolutions, as it were, fail? It's not because people aren't trying hard enough or they don't want it enough. I believe it's because they're not getting to the root cause, right? So one of the root causes that I don't think we talk about enough, and I think it's a very fresh idea in this new book of mine for people, is this idea that if you've got this internal stress, right, because you're taking offense to everything, or you're screaming at everyone, or you're rowing with your partner, you don't realize that emotional stress that you have created by the way you interact with that external event, it's not neutral, James. You will need to neutralize it in some way, right? Now, you can do that in a healthy way, going for a walk, going to the gym, or more commonly, we go to the vending machine, have a bit of sugar, have an extra coffee, have an extra beer, online pornography, 3 hours doom scrolling. And so we don't realize that those behaviors are an inevitable consequence of the internal emotional stress that we've got. And so I say to you, James, right, let's take a few years ago, right, when, let's say, you've got callers coming in, they're calling into your radio show, and they're being pretty punchy with their view, and you're trying to handle this. You know you're being listened to by lots of people. You, I'm guessing, got worked up sometimes in some of those conversations. Okay, right. So you're interacting, you've got worked up. Do you remember, after the show had finished, what you would then do? would you, for example, need a bit of extra sugar?
This is where I have the advantage on you, because I've read your book and you obviously haven't read mine. So my therapy journey talks about the difference in about 6 or 7 years ago, not long after I lost my dad, realising that I was being unhelpful to people in my life as a consequence of things that I've been carrying probably since I started getting beaten at prep school. So working through that in therapy did actually directly speak to where you're going now and help me understand, which is why I find so much of what you've written about so utterly compelling. I should also say that 10 years ago, I lost my dad in 2012. I would have laughed at any kind of book that told me you could make incremental change. I'd have laughed at therapy. I laughed at therapy when I went there. And this is why I don't know if holistic is a word you like. I mean, it's
so people will use it to refer to what I do.
I thought they might, but it's not quite there, is it?
I don't naturally resonate with it. I don't use it myself.
I understand why. That's why I asked, because it sounds a bit woo for a start. But what I found extraordinary and quite, I don't know, almost like welcoming about this from a personal perspective and from the things that we talk about on the radio show is the mission you set out at the very beginning of the book, which is to work out why so many of us who know that there is something wrong and know what we need to do to be better don't do it. And you use the example of your GP friend, and it's an incredibly... I've had callers who say, why should I listen to a nurse who's fat? And you have a GP friend who has precisely that experience, and you tell it in... quite sort of arresting terms when your friend phones you or you're speaking to a GP friend who's just tried to deter someone from a path of diabetes, an inevitable journey towards serious diabetes, and they say, why should I listen to you? You're fatter than I am. Yeah. And that takes you to the point where you realise, or it crystallises the knowledge, that so many people have the knowledge.
Yeah,
but they still don't do what they need to be done.
And when I met her that weekend, because she was very upset by this.
I bet she was.
When I met her, though, because some people...
She had chocolate buttons in her desk drawer. It's a wonderful image.
Yeah.
While telling this man to change his diet.
That was the fourth or fifth introduction I wrote. I remember when I met her that weekend, she said, because some people will get sidetracked and going, a patient shouldn't be talking to their doctor like that. That's not the point I'm trying to make, right? And to my friend's credit, she didn't sidetrack. She said, Rangan, the thing is, my patient was right.
Yeah.
Whilst I'm counselling him about excess sugar and ultra-processed foods, in my drawer are Cadbury's giant buttons, right?
It is, as I say, Alex, I did not expect you to get... Everyone's got it. I forgot that they sound similar. I wasn't talking about... Although obviously the accent has made me think that... who is it that he reminds me of? But it was more the zeal. It was more the missionary zeal, this determination, this very authentic and sincere determination to improve other people's lives that made me think of the person that millions of people have... It's not Ed Miliband, Alan. What are you talking about? But you're right. It was Martin Lewis. Absolutely. The money-saving expert, bringing to the world of personal finance exactly the sort of altruism and passion that Rangan brings to the world of health, in this case, mental health or stress, happiness. And guess what? They went to the same school. He didn't even know that. So I'm sitting there thinking, who is it? And then I go, oh, yes, it's him. And then what school did you go to? They actually went to the same school. And Rangan didn't even know that Martin Lewis had been to the... Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Sorry if you didn't. Back to the conversation about obsessive-compulsive disorder, the reality of it, if you like, as opposed to the reported reality. The two can be very, very different. Nick's in Caterham. Nick, what made you pick up the phone?
I find it an interesting subject. Yes. It's something... I'm 65 now. It's something I've suffered from since I was 11. But over the years it comes and goes, right. And it's gradually got a lot less severe, and sometimes it goes away completely. I suppose the thing I'm lucky about, I've never been diagnosed. I don't need to be. I hadn't even heard the term till I was in my 30s.
Really?
In fact, I saw a TV play. I think it was called something like, it sounds awful, something like Dirty Stupid Sex or something like that, but there was an OCD character in there, right. And I suddenly realised...
That's me. That's me.
I knew there was something like that all along, but I just felt it's something I had to cope with. But the thing that's maybe a bit unusual, I can pin down why mine started and when it started.
Really?
When it began to fade, and why... Yes. So... I went to public school, and I went in the junior form, and I did very, very badly in my first year. And I came under a lot of pressure to do much, much better.
Yes.
And that kind of snowballs to having to do extremely well. So I put myself under enormous pressure to study, working very hard hours from 11 right until my A-levels.
Gosh.
And that all came out in terms of me wanting to do things to protect myself from failing. So an example, I mean, I did lots of hand washing under very hot water all day long, that kind of thing, whenever I could. But one of the strangest things was I used to share a bedroom with my brother, and just before I went to bed, I'd have to walk around the bedroom and tap every object in a certain sequence 9 times, and then go around 3 more times. It used to take me about 45 minutes to get under the bed covers. Yeah. My brother would find it funny, and so just as I was getting into bed, he'd say, "Oh, you missed that car back there," and I'd have to do it again. And the strange thing is, I didn't know why it was 9 times. No. Yeah, I know. He'd still laugh if I told him. He wouldn't feel guilty. I even know why it's 9 times. I used to love cats then, I still do, and they had 9 lives. So everything had to be 9s or multiples of 9s or at a push 3s. And that's continued ever since. And then I kind of burnt myself out. I did well in my exams, and in my gap year before university, the pressure went away, and I really couldn't be bothered. I didn't want to go to university. And the symptoms just gradually faded away. They don't go away completely. I had them certainly through to my late 30s.
And presumably times of stress.
It was more a case of, if I don't. Yeah, well, it's actually times of stress exaggerated, but it was actually mostly just fear of things happening to my family, or they will get ill, or something.
And then
like
it gets exaggerated.
It
gets magnified, and that's. I mean, that is what you've highlighted. What all the calls have highlighted is the difference between unpleasant and intrusive thoughts. It's to do with control. I'm cracking on only because Sheila's here, and I'm out of time. I hope you don't feel unduly curtailed. That was fascinating, and it means that we end that conversation on a note of hope, actually, and the idea that A, as previous caller told us, treatment works, and B, things can fade with time, and the most crucial period can be often from sort of puberty through adolescence, 11 to 15. But of course, no 2 experiences will be the same. If you missed any of today's show, including Sabine from Shepherd's Bush, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including James O'Brien Daily, the best bits of my show in 60 minutes every day. Going to struggle today, Dan. That was an absolute corker of a show. How are you going to get that down to an hour of highlights? Anyway, you can download it now for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com, where you can also find Full Disclosure, the long-form interview series that comes back today after a rather long Christmas New Year jury service hiatus. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4 on LBC, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
For both of us, as it turned out, yeah.
James O'Brien on LBC.